Okay, so new unit, but short unit. Um, the uh, the ARE for foraging, or sorry, the UCE for foraging is finally out. I made the due date like the 28th of November, and I'm working on the social foraging one. I'll also make that the 28th of November, and the one for this that got pushed back will also be 28th of November. So they'll all just be clustered up. So they'll all be due the 28th of November, but I've already adjusted it so it automatically drops 7. So some of you may not be interested in running them anyway, but you can just basically view them as kind of practice assignments that sort of test you through the learning outcomes. And so those are being trickled out. Finally, the foraging one's out. All the AREs are out. The ARE for this one, there's a new one out there. I've seen some people have already started working on it. It's another one. We're back to squirrels. And so squirrels and tail wagging in the presence of snakes. Um, and otherwise, I think we've got quite a bit of feedback has been back. So if you haven't checked your organism assignment, do so. I think Anushka and I have both been going through and leaving feedback and trying to score them all. I think they all should be scored and have their feedback. There might be a couple of stragglers that were flagged for me to take a little bit more review of tonight, but otherwise, I think almost all but maybe two or three groups have gotten some sort of feedback or scores. The next deliverables are the last week of classes, the middle of the week, your presentation, and then there will be peer review that'll be due that Saturday. Just some tips from looking through the assignments is try to be specific about your hypotheses. So a lot of times people would say like they would say at the level of like urbanization has some effect on, I don't know, ground squirrels. And um, and that may be true, but what we're actually looking for is what specific aspect of urbanization. So is it the shade? Is it the heat? Is it the access to water? Is it something about the prey? So what is directly related to that behavior in some way that you could tie to a hypothesis that fits into one of our four groups? And so that's kind of, and then along with those hypotheses, then make sure you include a causal question, a hypothesis. Well, not we were looking for this on the assignment you just turned in, but moving forward, remember in your presentations, want to make sure that you're very clear on, like, say, the causal question. Now, the causal question might be inspired by the context. And so it might be that overall, this is why it's significant. But then that motivates a causal question, which might not be directly related to urbanization. The causal question might be, why do ground squirrels, aggregate around, I don't know, mulch piles or something like that. And that might relate to urbanization because you could say, urban landscaping produces a lot of mulch piles, and this perhaps has an effect on ground squirrels, which are observed to aggregate around these mulch piles. What is this doing to them? That suggests then the causal question, why do ground squirrels aggregate around mulch piles? And then that might suggest hypotheses that mulch, carries water, et cetera, et cetera. And so then that from that hypothesis, then you could say, in order to test my hypothesis or possible hypotheses, I've designed this experiment. And in this experiment, we're going to take the ground squirrel, we're going to collect some ground squirrels, and we're going to put some in an area with mulch and some in an area without mulch. And then we're going to measure how much water they drink and to see if there's a difference in the amount of water they drink if they also have access to mulch. And under our prediction, on the hypothesis that they're using mulch as a source for water, then possibly in the treatment where we've got mulch, we'll see them drink less water on average than the treatment without mulch. And so that would be sort of an example of how you kind of work all the way through that. So why do we care about mulch? Significance, then observation, interesting patterns. Seems like the ground squirrels like the mulch. So then the causal question, why do the ground squirrels like the mulch? And then it seems like, oh, it must be due to this, the water there. So and water is important to the ground squirrels. So there's a fitness benefit to being around the mulch because it helps them find other sources of water or something along those lines. So I mean, but that's kind of want to be explicit about those things in your project there so that it's very clear what hypotheses you're testing, and how your experiments do that. I did notice a couple of people still are phrasing hypotheses as if-then questions. And no hypothesis is an if-then question, that's a prediction. So I know that in the non-sciences, it's often taught that hypotheses are if-then questions, and that's basically a heuristic that helps them wrap the whole scientific process up into a little nugget that they can, that they can sort of say very quickly and move on from. But then here we have to unpack that when we're actually talking about building experiments. And it's true that everything culminates in an if-then. Like I designed an experiment, which is if experiment, then prediction because hypothesis. But why'd you even build the experiment in the first place? Well, that's because I have this hypothesis. Your hypotheses should be strong, concise statements like ground squirrels get water from mulch. That's a hypothesis. It's not if you were to mulch, landscape with mulch, then you would get a lot of ground squirrels around your mulch. That's not a hypothesis. The hypothesis is ground squirrels get water from mulch. I'm not saying ground squirrels do. I'm just trying to give an example. So that's the type of language that we want you to talk about in your kind of proposal pitch. And then that justification, that's the significance sort of statement. So why am I even asking that causal question? You have to give a little bit of a backstory. So each one of these little 10-minute pitches is going to have sort of like, here's a picture of the context in Phoenix. Here is a pattern that seems to be observed. This might be significant because this mulch is used all over Phoenix, and ground squirrels were this native animal. And so, this may be affecting them in certain ways. And so we then ask the fundamental causal question, why do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or how do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I imagine pros will start with that sort of thing, significance thing, motivate a question, and then say it could be a number of explanations. Hypothesis, 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 maybe just one, maybe one or two explanatory answers to that. And then in order for us to differentiate between these, we propose to do this experiment. And the reason why this is a worthwhile experiment to do is that if we do this experiment, then hypothesis one would predict this outcome, hypothesis two would predict this other outcome. So by doing the experiment, we'll be able to say it's hypothesis one and not hypothesis two, or vice versa. And then that's basically around where you close. So you motivate it, you say what you're going to do, you show that you've got these hard predictions there, and then maybe you close, bringing it back up to the top to remind you that, and once we know that it's hypothesis one but not hypothesis two, that would suggest a certain management plan. Or if there was hypothesis two and not hypothesis one, that might suggest a different management plan. And boy, it would be really great to know which management plan we should do to solve this problem that we identified at the top. And then that's it. So that's kind of the structure of the way these presentations should look like by the end of the semester. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, great. So we are now talking about self-defense and aggression. So this is not a snake. This is a caterpillar. So it's a hawk moth, a sphinx hawk moth caterpillar in particular. But it's it doesn't look like your average caterpillar. So what do you think's going on here? Any thoughts as to why this animal looks this way? Yeah. Yeah, so why would this deter predators? So I'll just spread it out, sir. Yeah, so predators might be afraid of snakes, and this isn't a snake. But if a predator is afraid of a snake, then maybe it'll be afraid of something that looks like a snake. So that's one hypothesis for the way things look here. So that's kind of this idea is that maybe you look like a viper. So vipers have certain shaped heads, their eyes are a certain way, and so this kind of looks like a viper head. So maybe it's a benefit for a caterpillar to look like a viper because birds that eat caterpillars themselves can get eaten by vipers. So maybe this whole pathway here is that in order to avoid being eaten by the bird, you look like the thing that could eat the bird. That's the sort of theory behind what's going on here. So this is what we broadly refer to as mimicry, resemblance between an organism and another object, possibly another organism. It doesn't have to be another organism. You could mimic other scary things. You could mimic plants that are scary. You could mimic, other, if there's anything that's unpalatable or potentially dangerous, you could mimic the look of that. It's not only the look either. A lot of the examples we have here, because I'm presenting them in this format, are going to be visual, but we also have acoustic mimics and olfactory mimics, chemical mimics. So you can smell like something that is unpalatable or scary. You can taste like something that's unpalatable or scary. You can sound like something that's unpalatable or scary. There's all sorts of different ways that you can mimic these things. And in all of those cases, we use this term where the thing that's being mimicked, visual or not, we call the model. And the thing that is mimicking, we call the mimic. So we'll say we got the mimic and the model. So mimic is pretty obvious. Model, sometimes it's a little weird. What do you mean by model? But model is the thing that makes what makes the cue or the signal salient. All right, so that's the terminology we'll use. Questions about that? All right, so this is, so mimicry. There's a lot of mimicry out there. So if I just go to the Wikipedia page on mimicry and then hit the table of contents, we find that there's all these different types of defensive mimicry. So there are sets of animals, complexes of animals that behavioral ecologists have gone out and studied and found, wow, these things look or smell or taste or sound like these other things. And our best explanations for what's going on here, or at least hypotheses that we've come up with that seem reasonable for us to test, we could categorize them into these different types of defensive mimicry. But there's also aggressive mimicry. There's reasons why predators may want to look like other predators or not look like other predators, or they may want to hide. They may want to look like something that's safer. And then there's reproductive mimicry as well. So there's all sorts of there are males that want to get access to females by going around other males by looking at so there's a lot of different mimicry. This particular unit, we're just focused on self-defense. And even within this unit, we just, the scope is pretty limited. And so we're primarily going to focus on these two classics, Batesian and Mullerian mimicry. But I don't want you to get the impression that these are the only types of mimicry out there. There's a wide catalog of mimicry. But if we look at these two, there's still some interesting things we can see. So for one, we look up here, this is a yellow jacket. This is a paper wasp. They look very similar to each other. These are unpalatable species. These are species that have a strong sting. These are predatory species. These are species that you want to stay away from. Uh-huh. It doesn't taste good, or you want to avoid it. It's not desirable. So these are not animals that another predator is going to want to try to eat unless it is specially built to attack these beasts up here. So so when two unpalatable species converge on a common appearance, that's referred to as Mullerian mimicry. What these two have done, these are both Hymenoptera. They're in some ways closely related Gesundheit, but they're 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 separated. They're not very close together in the phylogeny. And so they have converged on this yellow and black striped pattern here. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to help receivers. I say they're trying, but this is what natural selection has sort of converged on, is that there's this sort of set of signals that if this paper wasp, was blue and red polka dots, you could say, okay, a blue and red polka dot paper wasp, I'm going to stay away from that. But then if then the yellow jacket was yellow and black, then you have to remember, okay, yellow and black, yellow jacket, I'm going to stay away from that. Well, now you have to remember these two things to stay away from. A lot of this, the staying away from this is not necessarily innate, but is learned. So an animal might get stung by a yellow jacket or by a paper wasp, and then will remember that, or it'll try to eat one of these, and it will then remember that negative experience that wasn't fatal, and and then it will then carry that on into its life history. So it turns out that it's much more successful to have one set of warning signals than a whole bunch of them, because that way, you can sort of benefit from the learning from others. For if there's a bad experience with the paper wasp, then that sort of helps another potential predator or so on learn that they should also stay away from the yellow jacket and vice versa. So there's a universe out there where there are paper wasps that have blue and yellow polka dots or something like that, and then the yellow jackets look like this. But in that universe, it they're predator like overall the fitness of all of the animals in that community are not as high because it's harder for these signals to be picked up. So in our universe, selection has shaped these two unpalatable species to look like each other because it makes it simpler for the receivers. That's the hypothesis behind Mullerian mimicry, when two unpalatable things mimic each other. So before I go on to that, questions about that? Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah. That's a good question, right? So there was a question earlier, what does unpalatable mean? And we're going to get to Batesian here in a second, but cutting ahead, all of these down here, these hoverflies and this beetle, they're very edible. These are things that if you manage to find this hoverfly, there are tons of predators that there is no downside to eating this hoverfly. It has no defenses. It is defenseless, it's juicy, it's got lots of protein. It's a good thing to eat. But this thing up here, you can try to eat it. If you manage to eat it, it's kind of pretty juicy or whatever, but you're going to have to pay tremendous costs in order to eat it. So these have no costs, a lot of benefit. These may have benefit, but the costs kind of outweigh the benefit. Does that make sense? Yeah, I would say that yeah, you have to sort of think about who the receivers. These are all effectively signals or signal adjacent, and you have to say who are the receivers, and then for this receiver, is this a good thing for it to try to eat, for example? And for most receivers, this is a bad thing to pursue, but for most receivers, these are totally fine things to pursue. Other questions? Yeah. So if for a given receiver, the senders of these signals are unpalatable, are dangerous or scary, you don't want to approach, then it's actually better for them to converge in that signaling modality on the same signal. So if there's a lot of if there's many receivers all using vision, then you want to come up with a common visual signal. And it will be, so you'll get gradually in these communities where these live together, you'll find them converge upon these common signals. Now, on the flip side of that, there are these down here, these palatable species that a bunch of things would like to eat, and they have no defenses. That there's really nothing they can do. So rather than coming up with a functional adaptation to produce a defense, like there are beetles that blister beetles, for example, you can find here in Phoenix. And if you touch, I mean, they're called blister beetles because you get a big blister. Like they have these chemical defenses that are really bad. This beetle does not, this wasp beetle. And so their only defense, on the trade-off space of all the adaptations that they could, rather than developing a costly, metabolically costly defense system, they then decided, not decided, but they then exploited the niche of let's just look like something that's actually costly, even though we're not costly. So this is a type of deceit, really, is that you've got the honest signals up here, and then you've got the interspecific cheaters down here. That this signaling, this yellow and black stripes, that's evolved to be a warning that these are bad. Stay away from these. But down here, the yellow and black stripes are being exploited by other things that say, "Hey, I might be bad." You don't. It's dishonest. It's deceitful. If you actually eat these things, then you'll be totally fine. I mean, I don't know if you'll be totally fine, but there's an animal out there that'll be totally fine if they eat these things. But so their only defense is to look like things that actually have a defense. And that's Batesian mimicry. When a palatable prey item resembles the appearance, again, this could be olfactory, could be acoustic, it's visual here, of an unpalatable model species. So these are the models for these mimics. These two are sort of model and mimic together. Questions about that? The difference between Batesian and Mullerian. And I hope it's clear here that these don't have to be perfect mimics. So you notice just across here, there's a lot of variation. So exactly how good do you have to be to exploit this mimicry kind of depends on the visual acuity of the thing that you're trying to keep away from you, the thing you're trying to defend yourself from. So, like you're big, scary mammal predators. And it's my guess that if not now in your sort of adult stage, when you were much younger, if you saw any of these things, probably, maybe when you were younger, you had an experience with one of these or something that looks like this. And that probably left an imprint on you and you recovered from it and you were totally fine. But then later, when you started seeing these, then you stayed away from them. And and this down here, I'm guessing that although when we look at this and analyze this closely, we're like, that doesn't look at all like that. But it's my guess that there's some part of you that when you look at this fly, that's clearly a fly. It's got two wings instead of four. It's got these big funny eyes. That logical part of you, there's probably some part of you that looks at that and thinks that's a little scary looking. And that part of you, that innate part of you or that learned part of you that looks at these yellow and black stripes and says, that's a little scary looking, that's exactly what these mimics have picked up on. And that's why mimics do not need to be perfect. That there are a bunch of things out there that this is just scary enough to make them think twice about going for them unless they're really, really hungry. All right, questions about that? Batesian versus Mullerian mimicry is a self-defense strategy. Sort of honest up here, dishonest down here. Bates, by the way, it's named after somebody who hung around with Alfred Russel Wallace, like sort of, like Wallace and Darwin kind of came up with natural selection at the same time. Arguably, Darwin came up with it earlier, but he kind of procrastinated, wasn't able to get it out there. It's kind of like me and those UCEs or something. And then Wallace wrote to Darwin because Wallace he just adored Darwin. He was like Darwin was the Earth and Wallace was the moon, and he just really wanted Darwin's acceptance. And he sent his manuscripts to Darwin and said, "I have this cool idea. What do you think about it?" And it was natural selection, and Darwin was like, "Crap!" And that's what made Darwin publish. And they both published at the same time. We give Darwin a lot of credit for that, but Wallace came up with the exact same idea at basically the same time. And when Wallace was all doing his natural history thing, learning about this stuff, that he palled around with somebody named Bates, and Bates was really interested in mimics, and that's where we get Batesian mimicry. So, okay, great. So now maybe this is Batesian mimicry. Maybe that's a hypothesis that this is a palatable prey item. It's a juicy caterpillar. It is not toxic. And this is something you definitely do not want to try to eat. So you don't want to mistake these two. So if you're this bird, then maybe you avoid this because it looks like that. And that would be an example of Batesian mimicry. But remember, there are different forms of mimicry, and we can't cover all of them in this class. But I bring up this particular complex because it's a pretty interesting complex. So there's this nice paper written by Dan Jansen, who's sort of this famous tropical ecologist that's really prolific, a lot of really cool papers and interesting ideas. And Jansen was interested and then also just because I was at an entomology meeting, so this is a PNAS, the editor here, May Berenbaum, who was at PNAS here in Phoenix this week, is like super famous entomologist, as famous as she could be as an entomologist. So I just want to highlight that she is up there too. So she's like, whenever the White House wants to know about insects, they call her, and it happens once in every couple of years. And so she was the editor that carried this paper on, and Dan Jansen was interested in these caterpillars that look so much like snakes and have all these eye spots and stuff like that. And Jansen and co. Said that, actually, I think this complex, which I'll show you here in a second, is this such a mimetic complex differs from classical Batesian, Mullerian mimicry complexes of the adult butterflies. So the adult butterflies, there are toxic butterflies and that have evolved to look like other toxic butterflies, Mullerian mimicry. There are non-toxic butterflies that evolved to look like things that are unpalatable, Batesian mimicry, at the adult level. But he's saying, at the caterpillar level, at this larval level, and even at the pupal stage, that there's something else going on here that we actually can't honestly group into those two. So this is an example of some of these. So there's this caterpillar that folds these leaves into this sort of shelters. You can see the silk that's kind of pulling them together. There's kind of this weaving silk here. And so if you tear open this leaf, as Jansen did there and colleagues, then you find this end of the caterpillar. And within seconds, then you get it replaced by this end of the caterpillar that's got these big, scary red eyes. And so that's an example of these. So this looks very different than the viper example that I showed you a second ago. And in fact, you can look across these caterpillars, and there's just a whole lot of diversity and things that are kind of snake-like, kind of. I mean, they all have eye spots, and they definitely are doing the same thing, but it's hard to pinpoint what the model is exactly. There's just so much diversity, and even across the pupae. So they form their chrysalis or the cocoon, or I mean, depending on their moth or cat or butterfly, and even these pupae look like eye spots on them as they're hanging there, and maybe they have some adaptations that if you disturb them, they kind of rotate their eyes towards you and stuff like that. So looked at this kind of complex and again said, this is all in Costa Rica, in right around the same place there, and there just does not appear to be one model for all of these mimics. So it just seems different. So when you put all that together, they said, if we break this down, say, predators have an innate avoidance behavior of these patterns. That's one thing that's also different. Most of the times when you talk about like Batesian mimics or the types of things that mimics benefit, very often the predator has a learned response. It's like they eat the toxic thing, they get that, remember that response we learned about, that if once you throw something up once, you might remember it for the rest of your life. That level of learning is very different because most of the predators of these caterpillars have an innate response to this. So they're just born with an avoidance of caterpillars that have these weird eye spots. And so that's different compared to most of the like Batesian Mullerian. There's also far more mimics. So these harmless, immobile, edible, pupae and larvae than the dangerous possible models. So there's just a huge variety of mimics, hardly any models that look anything like this. And there doesn't appear to be any selective pressure for patterns to closely match the visual patterns for any predator. So the Batesian would be, these things look like a predator, like a snake. And there doesn't appear like these things are trying to match any particular predator, nor are they trying to match each other. So if other caterpillars were toxic, then that would be like Mullerian mimicry. If other caterpillars were toxic, but the one that the mimic wasn't, that would be Batesian. So it just doesn't fit Batesian or Mullerian here. So it seems like a different type of mimicry. And when you kind of think this through, if you think about all of these things here, you can ask the question, are the patterns in these caterpillars honest? Well, none of these caterpillars are unpalatable. So these patterns are, you can only find them in the caterpillars. There do not appear to be any models that share these that actually are unpalatable. So it's like these are totally palatable organisms that have a wide variety of these signals. So these signals really aren't honest because they're not coupled to anything honest, and they are not honest in themselves. It's just caterpillars that are unpalatable, but or that are totally palatable, and but they're not signaling the existence of any unpalatable thing out there. So that seems to be important that there's these dishonest signals, and then that makes us then ask the question, so in this case, does it make sense that we have such the huge diversity? I guess so. Let me ask you, what would happen if all of these caterpillars converged on one scary look? Given the answer to this question. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So because all of these patterns are dishonest, so they are not mimicking any honest signals out there, if they all converged on the same scary signal, then predators, if either over life history or over evolutionary history, because remember, most of the negative responses to these seem to be innate, predators would just start eating them because there wouldn't be any downside of that. Those predators that would eat the caterpillars that all look like this dishonest signal would be totally fine, and in fact, they would actually flourish. And then those predators would spread, and then eventually these caterpillars would not have any advantage. So this is an interesting case that because there is not a model, not a real model, there's actually seems to be selection against divergence in the signals. So the thought is that this diversity that could go back to in let's say the pupae, that's fine. All of these are sort of snake enough like that they seem to be received by birds and things like that, but they're it's almost like they're purposely diverse. Like if they all looked like the uncanny valley of a snake, then they would just get eaten. So in this case, when you don't have an honest model to mimic, it's actually advantageous to kind of look like something generic and then diversify and just add uncertainty. So that's the thought here. Is there's sort of the diversity here is sort of not an accident. If there was a less diverse set of signals, this whole complex of mimics would just, it would get eaten. It would lose all of its fitness benefits. So I bring this up because this idea of a mimicry complex is super important because often when we see mimics, they're around their models. And you find, like in the hoverfly examples, multiple mimics for the same models. You might find multiple models, Mullerian wise, sharing the same. So you get this community of organisms that are all making use of the same information somehow. And this is another weird example of that, where now you have a complex of caterpillars that don't really have a model, but they've managed to grab on to some innate fear of eyes, and just diversify the heck out of that. Like, here's some eyes, here's some yellow eyes, and then okay, you got the yellow eye niche, great. I'll get the green eye niche, and I'll do the black eye niche. But they all are sort of radiating out around this kind of like innate fear of eyes that are kind of snake-like, and then even though there's not any particular snake. So I hope that makes sense. So like with the wasp example, you want to look as wasp-like as possible. You want to converge on what wasps look like, because that is your only way to safety is to look like a wasp. Here, you want to diverge and look as different, like that's a new type of snake. So this is capitalizing on an innate fear in a predator The other one's potentially capitalizing on a learned fear in a predator. But the only way you can learn a fear is if it's a fear of something real. This is not real. And that's why it's likely the predators, got this innate thing. So that's a real contrast. We all still bin it into mimicry, but we just wouldn't refer to it as Batesian or Mullerian mimicry. It feels Batesian, but it's not. It just doesn't quite fit. Okay, questions about that? Big thing is I want you to know Batesian Mullerian mimicry. And I just want to be familiar with this caterpillar example, but just know that there's all sorts of other really cool functional reasons why you get different types of mimicry. You have some really, really toxic predators. How about this? Yeah, here's a question. If I'm a really, really toxic prey, and so toxic that if you eat me, you die immediately, why might I want to look like a less toxic prey? Yep. Well, let's say it's not so. I mean, of course, there's camouflage, but let's just say, so let's say that I'm already stand out, like I already look at a certain way, but there is sort of some descendants of like, why is it beneficial for really toxic, so toxic that if you're eaten, it immediately kills the predator? Why might such a extremely toxic prey item want to look like a less toxic? Yep. There you go. Right. So that's the hypothesis. That is another one of these mimicries. You go to Wikipedia page, you can find that is one of the thoughts is that extremely toxic prey items sometimes will look like less toxic ones because they are exploiting the learned aversion, the taste aversion from the less toxic ones that they can't. There might be constraints, developmental constraints that can't make themselves less toxic. They're just that toxic. So you can say, why didn't you just evolve to be less toxic so that you have a learning benefit there? And there just might not be a way to do that. So instead, you mimic this other signal, and then most of the time you'll benefit from the less toxic species. But then at least there's this last resort. But those predators that have to learn in order to get that aversion, they're not going to get that from you. They're going to get that from this other species. So those are sort of examples where all sorts of weird ways that there's weird hypothetical advantages to mimicking different things, and that's why there's that giant list of mimicry there. So Bates and Mullerian, though, that's the big ones. All right, any questions about any of that? Okay. All right, so that's mimicry is about sort of deceitful signaling, but there's also honest signaling. In fact, you need some honest signaling in order to have some models for things to mimic. And one of the ways to be a model is to actually have a chemical, for example, a chemical defense. And so when you're signaling that you are unpalatable, that is what we call aposematism or aposematic signaling. So this poison frog, this leaf-eating bug, and then this is a different type of sphinx caterpillar that actually is very toxic. And so all of these actually are things that if you eat, it's going to be a very bad experience. And so along with evolving this unpalatability, they've also evolved this kind of signal of them being less palatable. And there's had some convergence on certain types of colors. So you notice kind of reds are often used, yellows are often used. So these are things that say stay away from you. And that's aposematic signaling. So use of a warning coloration to inform potential predators, the animal is poisonous, venomous, or otherwise dangerous. Now, what's interesting is that you can have a combination of these things. Like, why did this caterpillar sort of settle on that? as it's signaling. Well, it looks an awful lot like a coral snake. So you can have like a combination of selective pressures here where, because there's coral snakes that are sympatric with these, they live in the same area as these caterpillars, then not only is the caterpillar actually toxic and it's beneficial for it to signal that it's toxic, but in picking the signal, it can benefit from mimicking this coral snake that's also kind of a bad deal to try to go after when you actually want the caterpillar. So there's multiple things can be going on at once. Aposematic signaling. If you go down to southern Arizona, you find these giant um, grasshoppers, called lubbers, sometimes called Mexican generals. They're really big. They're beautiful caterpillars. You can stretch out their wings. They're really red. A lot of coloration. If you scare them, sometimes they jump. They usually land on their side. Why might that be? Why do you think such a toxic caterpillar with bright colors is really bad at running away? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. They don't need to run away. Nothing eats these lubbers, these Mexican generals, these beautiful giant. They are look super juicy and like there are birds that in theory should be going after these things, but it's so effective, nothing comes close to them. So they basically lost the ability to jump away. They are saltatorial animals, so they have evolved. Their ancestor evolved the ability to jump to quickly get away from predators, and they've basically lost it. So you can, as a human behavioral ecologist, not going to eating them. You can play with them, and but they're just really bad at running away from you. Like I said, they usually, they can't manage to land on their feet, and that's because they're so effective at doing this. Questions about that? Pretty easy. So that's an example of how you become a model. Startle behavior is another interesting strategy to use. Sometimes, if you're a prey item, all you need is a couple of seconds. So, a lot of lepidopteran, moths, butterflies, have evolved, for example, these eye spots. And they usually sit with their wings to close together. And if you get next close to them, they open them really quick. And then suddenly, oh, there's eyes. And so the thought is, this is a hypothesis. All these are hypotheses, just things that when you observe this in nature, then you have to go out and test. And the hypothesis here is that the natural predators of these moths, then if they see those spots, they pause. So if you had a way, like how would I test that? Well, if you had a way to, for example, paint over these spots, and then you could have a group of these with the spots and without the spots, then you could measure the pursuit time, for example, of the predator, and you might find that in the ones with the spots get away more often than the ones without. And you'd have to have some control, like you'd have to paint them with like a transparent thing so that you control for the weight and all of that sort of stuff too. But that's the idea. So that this startle behavior is the sudden production of movement, sound, or another stimulus that distracts the predator. So like the there's this show on Netflix, the Diplomat, with the star is someone from my youth. I know as Felicity, but that I think is a reference. It's sort of lost now, but she talks about how in when there's a tense situation, she yells water in the middle of a room, and usually everybody is startled, and it usually brings the things down. She said it's useful because, at least in her dialect, it's the same number of syllables as fire, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So it just sort of surprises people, and then usually it brings them back into it. That's kind of the same thing here. That's them sort of yelling water. It's like these are not actually real eyes, but for a second, it seems like they're real eyes. And that gets the predator's attention, and it takes it away from what it's doing, and that gives the butterfly or the moth enough time to fly away. So startle behavior is another thing that you can do. And then crypsis, which is sort of adjacent to mimicry. So here is a caterpillar that is not trying to be conspicuous, is trying to do something very opposite to that. And so it blends in to this leaf. Speaking of leaves, this is a moth. right there. It looks like a dead leaf. This is what it looks like when it's opened up. Here's another example of a dead leaf moth opened up there. But when they close their wings, they look like dead leaves. Of course, a walking stick, when it's on a human arm, very easy to see, but when it's in its natural habitat, then it's very difficult to tell the difference between a walking stick. Has anybody seen what a walking stick will sometimes do when if you kind of jiggle a table or you blow wind by it? Yeah, they kind of dance, they kind of wiggle back and forth. They kind of blow in the wind. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it just like a regular stick. If it was like unattached to a tree, if there's wind, it would kind of wiggle. And that also, this idea of crypsis, like I point that out because crypsis also includes behavior. So it's not only looking like an object, but it can be acting like that object as well. So that it's natural for a stick whenever you kind of bump against it, or if there's a wind go by it, to kind of shake her a little bit like that. So the walking stick too, if you kind of get close to it or if you blow across it, then it'll just start rocking its body back and forth, kind of like a real stick. And that's another example of crypsis. So a lot of these examples I've been into camouflage. But crypsis also includes hiding. So, if cockroaches are really good at hiding. So there's like dark spots, and once you turn on the light, they find the nearest dark spot and they go away. That is also something we've been into the category of crypsis. So wiggling your body to look like a twig wiggling, that's crypsis. Hiding, that's crypsis. Just generally looking like the background, that's camouflage, which is another form of crypsis. So we view this as self-defense. The best defense is to not get into the aggression to begin with. And then there's always a chance that you're still going to you can't count on all of these things working all the time. So vigilance is what you do when there's always a possibility of a predator, not paying attention to all these things and then making an attack, or just needing to know that there's a predator nearby so that you're mobilized. Because oftentimes the best self-defense is just running away, but you can only run away if you know a predator's nearby. And so these prairie dogs, they need to do a lot of, like, there's a huge opportunity cost of vigilance, but a lot of them, they'll stay and they'll just, they could be foraging right now. They could be looking for mating opportunities. They could be digging. It's a huge opportunity cost of vigilance, but there are so many predators for these juicy prairie dogs that it's really important for them to keep their head up and then actually generate alarm calls so that their related individuals can be notified that there is a predator, so they can mobilize, usually a flight. So not mobilizing a defense, but they're fleeing from the area. So that's what I mean by vigilance. Actually, I think it comes from the word for to stay awake or something like that. So it's awareness that an animal has of its surroundings and the potential presence of predators. The article that you'll read about the ground squirrels and the tail wagging uses a vigilance hypothesis that it tests, as well as some other hypotheses. It sort of tests them against each other. So that you'll see there. And then, eventually fighting happens. So, we talked a little bit about Nash equilibria before, game theory. So we talked in the last time about the stag hare, or the stag hunt game, where the two strategies were stag or hare, and it was about cooperation and cooperative foraging and so on. There is a similar thing here called the hawk dove game. And so the hawk dove game fits into the same category of games as producer scrounger. So in the hawk dove, you have two players that come into an engagement. In this case, you could imagine them to be two individuals of the same species, because all this self-defense stuff also talks about intra-specific interactions. And so in the hawk dove, you could say, well, if I am holding on to a resource, do I fight to keep the resource, or do I give the resource away? This also applies to interspecific as well. Do I evolve adaptations for fighting or adaptations for fleeing? But oftentimes we're talking about behavioral changes. Do I escalate to fight, or do I flee? So fight or flight. And the way hawk dove is modeled here is a payoff matrix, something like this, where if you have a hawk who plays another hawk, they both lose out. And so the idea here is there's a resource, basically. We'll call the resource has a value of 10 fitness units. And so if a hawk plays a dove, the dove loses the resource, the hawk gets all of the resource. And so you get that 10. If two doves end up coming into play, they don't fight, they just split the resource up between them. So that's why it's referred to a tie here. So win, lose, tie. And so it's just 10 divided by 2 there. And then if two hawks fight each other, then the idea here is the fight ends up costing them some fitness units. So you have the fitness you gain minus the fitness you lose in the fight, and then that's basically shared between them. And so that's why you get this negative. So regardless of what the numbers are, you get this lineup down here. And again, I mentioned this is sort of like producer and scrounger. It's a little bit like, you know, if you have two scroungers, that's a little bit like two hawks. Nobody's going to get any food if everybody's a scrounger. If you have two producers, that's like a tie. That's fine. They both find food on their own, albeit maybe at a slower rate. But if one of them's producer and the other one's scrounger, then the scrounger doesn't have to pay any cost to do the production and potentially can steal that food from the scrounger. So that's why this sort of fits. Producer scrounger is a version of a hawk dove game. And so if we talked about Nash before, there are two so-called pure Nash equilibrium here. So if you play hawk uh, and the other one plays dove, then neither of you are going to regret that decision. The dove is not going to want to play hawk if you're definitely going to want to play hawk, because then that's going to cost the dove -5. But then the hawk is not going to play dove if the other one's playing dove, because it's better to play hawk when the other one's playing dove. So this up here is a Nash, and this down here is a Nash. There's no regrets if you happen to be in this universe or in this universe. But the problem is that you don't know who's supposed to be the hawk and who's supposed to be the dove. This is also related to like traffic lights or whatever. Like if you don't have stop signs, if you don't have stoplights, somebody gets to go and somebody has to wait for the other one to go. But if there's no way to break that symmetry, you don't know who's supposed to go and who's not. But it's really beneficial for you guys to to sort of agree to disagree. You don't, you know, the north-south direction can't be turned on at the same time as the east-west direction. That's just bad for everybody. So this is what we call an anti-coordination game, where the two individuals have to agree to do the opposite thing. And the way we solve these problems in human problems is often by introducing a device like a stoplight and a gesundheit. And so if you see a green light, you know the other side sees a red light, and it's actually beneficial for you both to follow that. And so the someone who decides to go through the red light is pretty much guaranteed that the other partner is going to go through the green light and they're going to get into a collision, and that's the X collision there. So everybody, it's best for them to follow the turn or follow the signals, the street lights. So if you don't have that, if you're out, you know, there's no stoplights in nature, then there is a mixed equilibrium, which is that a certain fraction of time you play hawk and another fraction of the time you play dove. Or alternatively, in a population of potential hawks and doves, a certain fraction of them are hawks and a certain fraction of them are doves. And this is exactly what we find in the producer scrounger game. The equilibrium there is there's a certain fraction of producers and a certain fraction of scroungers. If everyone plays hawk, then you're constantly going to run into jerks and get into fights, and everybody's not going to be good, you know, better off. If everybody plays dove, then there's an opportunity for a hawk to come in and steal from those doves. So there is a process that stabilizes an equilibrium where there's some part of the population plays hawk and some part of the population plays dove. And this theoretically predicts that in defensive applications here, then you're going to get a certain fraction of aggressors And submissives and dominants. You're going to get a certain fraction of animals that are going to escalate to fight and a certain fraction that are not. And so this, based on the way these numbers work out, the way the balance of these numbers depends on where that balance is. So that will shift things towards all fighters or all flighters or fleers, or something in between. But we have models to help us predict when you fight and when you don't. And so this is a hypothesis for how you explain variation in fighting ability or fighting preference in nature. All right, so that's the hawk dove. Any questions about the hawk dove, also called the chicken game? Yep, it is. It's named after John Nash. Yep. That's right. This all fits into the game theory. And so, Beautiful Mind, the movie with Russell Crowe, is about John Nash. And so, yeah, that was one of Nash's. He actually, he thought his major. This is, I think, what he got the Nobel Memorial Prize for, was for this work, not Hawk Dove, but the Nash Equilibrium. But he thought, his more important work was in some other things. And he thought this was just sort of a kind of a natural kind of curiosity, but it ended up being very influential in economics and behavioral ecology and so on. If you've heard about the evolutionary stable strategy and any other classes, like an evolution, an ESS is a special type of Nash, and it all comes from John Nash. Other questions? So I mentioned, I kind of talked about how I don't find that there's actually a lot of practical value in the prisoner's dilemma. It makes it too good to cheat. It's rarely is it ever that good to be a defector in nature. But hawk dove and stag hunt, there are a ton of stag hunt problems out there, and there are a ton of hawk dove problems out there. And if using these lenses, there's a lot more interesting things you can say. And so you see in the literature, you see these things show up as more sort of influential models, that actually make predictions that you can test for. Whereas the prisoner's dilemma, its solutions are pretty much all defectors or, under weird conditions, all cooperators, and you never see any of those cases in nature. Rarely usually see mixtures, and both the stag hunt and the hawk dove provide you ways of thinking about those mixtures. All right, so questions about any of that? Yep. Oh, well, sorry, I'll go, then I'll go to you. Yep. Uh-huh. That's a good question. So you can go both ways. You can model within the same community, then what is sort of the mixture? Is there a hawk niche and a dove niche? And then what are the relative size of those? But then also often within species, you get, how is there an evolutionary stable strategy? I'm sorry, is there a Nash where there's going to get a certain fraction of the population is sort of aggressive and they take, and then another fraction is submissive and they kind of give. And you would think, like, why would it ever be like, in the end, the benefits to both strategies balance. That's the crazy thing about the hawk dove game. You describe it and you're like, oh, it sucks to be a dove. You're always having your stuff being stolen. But it also sucks to be a hawk, because whenever you encounter other hawks, then doves never have access to this box. This is a really bad box to be in. That's the box that you have access to as a hawk. So that jerk who's always trying to get into a bar fight or whatever, it's not good to be that jerk. That jerk's constantly getting taken to the hospital. That's what this box is. That's the jerk who's always fighting at the bar. And so, although it seems like that jerk is always going to beat up, this person here and take their stuff, that's true. But then they're also getting into fights with other jerks. So it balances out so that in these populations, you actually get, there's a frequency dependence here, that when the population is full of one strategy, it is actually better to be the other strategy. And we don't talk about this, but there's other sorts of really interesting examples of, like, there are cichlids in this, which fish that have that eat scales off of other fish. And so there's a lake in Africa where these cichlids are native to, and if you fish these cichlids out, then you'll find that some of them they have their mouths are on the left side of their body, or their mouths are on the right side of their body. And the the fish that they eat are a different species. They have these big scales. Those fish have a tendency that if they feel a little something going on, this kind of goes on as self-defense, so I'm bringing this up. If they feel a twitch kind of towards their back end, they have a bias to turn to the right or turn to the left. And if they turn and they see the cichlid, they can fight the cichlid off. But if they turn the wrong way, the cichlid actually eats the scale off the other side. So then this cool thing is you get this oscillations back and forth where sometimes you sample the lake and you find like almost all left mouth cichlids. And at that point, it's actually beneficial to become a right mouth cichlid because eventually the prey ends up learning to have this defense to look toward the left mouth cichlid. And at that point, once the preys are all looking this way, then it's now beneficial to eat on the other side. And so you get this kind of oscillation, but it's an oscillation around a mean of a roughly half and half. So, that's kind of what goes on in the balance here. So there's these two strategies that are balancing themselves out because there's this frequency dependence. And that's what's going on here. There's a frequency dependence between hawk and dove. And so you get an equilibrium population where you get some doves and some hawks because it's never good in the population to get all hawks or all doves. Question. Okay, great, great. Anything else? Okay, well, that is our abbreviated unit. So we can move on to the next unit next time. Just reminders here. So take a look at the feedback that we've put back in on your projects and the new UCE that's out there and the new ACE that's out there. And I guess we'll do a little eye clicker. And sorry, I get over here and I've been staring at that projector, so you probably can't tell, but like if you come up to me after class, I have no idea who's in front of me right now. Like it's just like this giant ball of white. Um, so here we go. All right, so question is, what is it called when a palatable prey mimics an unpalatable prey? So unpalatable prey is the model, palatable prey is the mimic. So palatable mimics unpalatable. The prey that's liable to be eaten mimics the prey that is defensive. So the defenseless prey mimics the defensive prey. And that's all I've got. Uh-huh.